All right. Well, welcome everybody. You're here at our Building Forward series with Visionality. I'm Emily Barany. I'm the owner and founder, and this is Kristiana, and she is our senior project manager. And today we are going to talk about wages in the nonprofit sector. So, Kristiana, what is a living wage?
So a living wage is actually, I have it up here. Basically, a living wage is the theoretical income that allows individuals or families to afford adequate shelter, food, and other necessities. Living wages are designed to prevent individuals and families from falling into poverty, which is a very low bar for success. If you're trying to keep your employees from falling into poverty, that is considered a living wage. And living wages are often used as kind of like, I don't necessarily want to use the term gold standard, but they're used as a standard of, oh, we provide like living wages to our employees. Great. So you're basically barely preventing them from falling into poverty. We like to talk about a thriving wage. So a thriving wage is a living wage plus an amount that reflects your organization's mission, vision, and values in order for employees to actually thrive in their environment and their communities and not just live adequately to survive. So we really like to see this as a combination of pay and or benefits that ultimately increases the amount of money that goes into and stays in an employee's financial accounts. And this can be done within a couple different ways. And Emily and I always like to talk about like the levers that we can pull in order to kind of make these things happen. One of those, really as it pertains to benefits, it pertains to pay, but then there's a lot of equity and equality issues that kind of come into that as well that we'll discuss a little bit later as well. But essentially, like the goal with this project, and this is something that Visionality is working on this year, is why a thriving wage for the nonprofit sector instead of just a living wage in the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector has so often been treated as kind of like second-class citizens from the standpoint of like, oh, you love your work, like how like wonderful is that? And so we often have like board members or just members of society going like, you do such good work, that's really nice, it's okay that you make less. Yet these people forget that like good feelings and having or doing good work doesn't pay your bills, it doesn't pay the rent, it doesn't pay the mortgage, it doesn't cover cost of driving your car.
And sometimes it can, often I think, it's more emotionally taxing. So that's what's so fascinating is, yes, in the nonprofit sector, we get to make the world a better place. And there are so many good feelings associated with that. But our nonprofit colleagues often do the hardest work. And now they're being asked consistently to be paid less than their for-profit counterparts. And that just seems counterintuitive to me.
Well, and I always love this example of like, oh, you do good work, therefore you should get paid less, essentially is what that argument boils down to. So I always like to try to adjust that to the for-profit sector of like, okay, so let's say that there's a banking institution that focuses primarily on providing like flexible loans to low-income families. Should those people get paid less just because they're doing good work? Or if somebody likes their job, should they get paid less simply because they like their job? And the answer is no. Those are really stupid things to ask of somebody, and unreasonable, let's be honest. And so as we're looking at the nonprofit sector, we really have to treat the nonprofit sector as a sector. It produces social changes, as Emily loves to say. Like we all produce things in the world. The nonprofit sector produces social change, and so there is no reason why this sector should be paid less. Unfortunately, like there is a very long history associated with this that would be longer than our 25-minute timer, which I forgot to start.
I started mine.
There you go. There's a very long history of why nonprofits are continually paid less. It really has a lot to do with like philanthropy coming from the church, providing to the poor, and so there's a whole messy history of that we don't need to get into today. But we're really going to focus today on the reason and ways to implement thriving wages. And so the next thing we kind of want to talk about is equity versus equality, when you're kind of implementing these kind of the opportunity for a thriving wage. And this is something that we have been working on a lot at Visionality, just in terms of like, how do we make sure that people have the right set of tools to help them succeed, but also how do they have the right set of like financial opportunities so that people have, you know, opportunities to continue to, again, put and keep money in their financial accounts.
Well,
One of the ways that we're looking at, go ahead.
Let's talk just for a minute, the difference between equity and equality. You know, I, for so many years, ran our business thinking equality, equality. And I think a huge change that you brought into our company was no, equity. And what you exactly just said, each of us need different tools to thrive. You know, I need contacts to thrive, and you know, you need to exercise every day to thrive, and you know, Brienne needs to read 400 books a week to thrive. And so not treating every employee equal, but actually treating them individually, and working with each employee or team member to identify what is the very unique set of tools that you specifically need in order to do your best and live a really happy and fulfilled life.
And one of the things that we actually came to with this, and a story that I'm going to tell about me getting hired on at Visionality here, when Emily gave me my offer, I basically told her that because Visionality currently didn't offer health benefits, that essentially my pay was going to be reduced by over $5,000 a year from what she was offering, because I was going to have to completely cover my health benefits. Whereas like some of the other employees that were already at Visionality had spouses with health benefits. My spouse does not have health benefits, so we have to pay our own. And yeah, I pay about $550, you know, a month for my health benefits, which is, you know, which is a lot. I wouldn't walk by it if it was sitting on the street. And so that was kind of like our first conversation around that equity conversation of like, somebody who already has their health benefits covered by a spouse is able to take home a greater percentage of their paycheck because they don't have to cover that. Whereas my take-home pay is reduced by over $5,000 a year because I have to pay for my health benefits. And so that was our first conversation as it pertained into equity, is making sure that it's just like, how do we make sure that, again, our employees have, like, we pull those levers so that employees are able to put more money that stays into their checking account. That also allows them to save more. It allows them to spend more, which is good for our local economy. And it is far above like creating a poverty threshold of like, hey, we're keeping you out of poverty, you're welcome, versus like, hey, like we're doing really good things for you and you actually have opportunities to do things outside of work.
Well,
the other thing, go for it.
It costs money, you know, like money doesn't grow on trees. We've heard that. Like, you can't magically increase someone's pay or add benefits or add more paid time off. That all costs money, and it has to come from somewhere. So we recognize that, you know, you still have to figure out the dollars, and we can talk a little more about some strategies for that. But what is wild, you know, at Visionality, we sell time, and our product, our assets, are our employees. And so many nonprofits that we work with will say the same thing. You know, their employees are using their time to create social change. And so you can't say our employees are our biggest asset and then treat that asset poorly. You know, if it was a real estate investment and you never did any maintenance, you never cut the grass, you know, you never freshened up the paint, the value of that asset decreases. And what is wild, and we've seen this in Visionality, is the better you treat your employees, the more space that you give them, the more kindness that you give them, which all costs money, by the way, the better they do, the harder they work, the better their work product is, the happier they are. And so, yes, I recognize that this literally costs us money. However, it's an investment into the product that we manufacture and sell, which is consulting time. So it actually, even though it costs money, it really pays dividends, both in work product, but also employee retention. And turnover, holy goodness, is something really, really expensive.
So how much does it cost us if an employee leaves? Like, what is so because this is never a dollar amount that shows up on like profit and loss statements. It never shows up within, kind of like a nonprofit's annual numbers. But what is the cost of losing an employee for us approximately
Yeah.
right now?
So I calculated it probably about 5 years ago. So I'm assuming it's more now, but 5 years ago, it was literally $20,000.
And
And
that wasn't for like our highest paid employee. That was for just like
any,
any employee.
any employee. And so, we track every second of our time. So that $20,000 is essentially the hourly rate of paying our employees to take over the outgoing employees, clients, the time it takes us to hire somebody, and then the time that it takes us to train somebody until they're really up and running, which honestly takes 3 to 5 months before our employees are really just like nailing it and pulling in the work that we need them to do. And so what's so insidious is that $20,000 just never showed up anywhere. It was just a decrease in our profit. So it's not like I can see a line item and say, oh, we spent $20,000 on rent this year when we spent none last year. It just disappears. And so actually one year at Visionality, we were having really high turnover and we weren't paying that great. And I thought, well, shoot, if I'm disappearing $20,000 every time someone leaves, what if I instead gave it to that employee and maybe that would encourage them to stay longer? And so we did that. One year we gave everyone a 20% pay increase across the board. And we in fact spent that 20 grand on our employees instead of making it just disappear through turnover. And we did drastically increase our employee retention.
Yeah, so I would actually encourage like any organization to look at like what your turnover rate is like on even like a 2-year basis. So if within 2 years you lose 2 employees, and let's just say that it is about $30,000 to replace that employee, so that's $60,000. So if you had an extra $60,000 to invest in your employees, like how would you do it? Because you are losing that money even if it doesn't show up like in your checking account. Okay, so I want to move on from that aspect of this, and I actually really want to talk about the other aspects of pay. Time is money. And I think that that's another really interesting concept for us to talk about as well. We just had a discussion yesterday that we wanted to share as part of this conversation of one of the levers that we as a company have is time, and but time costs us money, but it also in fact is investing in our employees. So we increased the number of paid holidays per year. We increased vacation accrual rates, and we're playing with the idea of actually shutting our business down for a full week once a year. That's from the standpoint of helping reduce burnout, because if we're reducing burnout, we're increasing productivity. And if we're increasing productivity, we're increasing like our output, which means we're increasing our profit. And so it's really, again, like it's hard to think of it as math because I'm terrible at math. But if your employees are better invested in, they're going to give you a better product. They're going to give you a more efficient workload. Therefore, your cost to do work is going to go down. And when nonprofits, and one of the things that we see nonprofits do when they kind of come across like a new pot of money or like a surplus of money, is they invest it into programs, which is a double-edged sword, because if you're investing into your programs, most ways that they're invested into is by like, oh, we want to serve more people, so we should do this and this and this. Instead of looking at it of if we actually invest back in our employees are going to be more efficient, and therefore we will also continue to be able to serve more people because our employees are less burnt out and are able to do a higher productivity output. And so I always kind of take this step back when nonprofits just want to invest in programs first instead of the people, because if you're continuing to spread your people, because they never hire enough people to implement these new programs, they just stack it on their old people. So they think that they're actually doing good by their mission to have increased programs. Because, if we have more programs, we can serve more people. instead of like, what is your core programming and your core offering right now? What are you already doing a really good job at? And if you were just to increase the efficiency of that by investing in your people, you could still actually serve more people without having to create all this additional overhead and this additional programming work and this additional burnout.
Well,
So I would encourage organizations to look at, what are you already doing that you can do better by actually having fresh-minded and rested employees and well-paid employees.
But in addition to that, your employees need to be treated within your mission, vision, and values. And so any organization who made a social justice or social equity statement, this is a perfect way to show that in your balance sheet, period, full stop.
We were having a conversation with an organization 2 weeks ago. They have a position open that they're hiring for that had an exceptionally low pay range to it. The feedback that they were receiving was that people could afford, that's the word, people could afford to take that job because they had a significant other that had an income that was higher than theirs, or they were semi-retired, or they didn't care how much they made as long as they were happy because they were independently wealthy. So when we underpay our people, we're also really not diversifying our workforce, because if we're only hiring people who can afford to work for us because we're not paying them well, you're really narrowing the scope of who's going to be coming into your organization. So again, if you said anything about diversity this year, if you've said anything about equity inclusion, you really have to look at how pay is part of that plan. Because if your pay structure is such that people have to afford to work for you instead of using your organization as a place where they want to thrive for the next 5 to 10 years and really grow their career, instead of like, oh, like I just want to get the experience and then I'll be gone in a year, it's not going to be good for you. It's not going to be good for your organization as well. And it's also not playing into any of the DEIJ work that we've all been, giving service to this past year. It's, as Emily says, the receipts are coming due. And so it's time for organizations to really take that step up and figure out, like, if they're doing DEIJ work, like how are they actually doing that as it pertains to pay? Because pay for our employees really is kind of that first step. I never want to have a conversation in an interview again where somebody's like, I can afford to work for you, versus like, I can establish my career here and be here long term. So it's because it was a problem we solved a couple of years, like a while ago, of Emily always said that this was the job that people used to have before they got their dream job. And so that's why we had high turnover, because we weren't necessarily paying at a rate that was competitive. And we've now had 2 pretty significant pay increases over the past 5 years. And now we are becoming a far more competitive, company to be working with. We're not 100% where we want to be, but I feel like we're making significant progress on that. And it's because, like, between pay, between benefits, between time off, between flexibility, it's not just like, oh, you have a great team and, oh, we make you feel good. Because again, like, having a great team is good, but having a great team also doesn't pay the bills. And so we need the pay to back that up too.
Yes. And again, I recognize it all comes down to numbers. And so one thing that was really happy for me as the person who's ultimately responsible for payroll was setting a big target in the future. And then, so what we're looking at is, what do we want our compensation packages to be in 3 or 5 years? And then as we move closer to that target, there are these different decision points. And at each of these decision points, we can decide to pay more, pay what we can, adjust in this way, collect feedback from our employees and make these changes. So it's, incredibly intimidating to say, we want to increase everyone's pay by 35%, or, we want to have the most competitive benefits package, or, we want health, vision, and dental. And when you're running a business, and I always say nonprofits are businesses, you will be met by these decision points, and you can look at your P&L and look at your balance sheet and say, oh, at this decision moment, we can afford to do a little more. And then you make sure that you're right, and you kind of figure it out. Oh, here's another decision point. We can afford to do more, which is exactly what we did literally yesterday by doubling the number of federal holidays, paid holidays, and doubling our vacation accrual. So it was something that I didn't feel we could afford before. And we were at this decision point where we're posting another job position that's open. And it's like, no, this is in line with our mission, vision, values. We can afford it. And it's one step closer. And then then I get to continue to pull those levers to say, okay, here's how we're going to increase our profitability so that at the next decision point, we can make another choice to increase equity in our company.
Okay, Emily, how much time do we have left?
4 minutes.
Excellent. How do we talk to our boards about this? Because at the end of the day, there's a huge conflict, and there is, between the amount, normally our boards make significantly different money than our employees do, and or they have made significantly different money in their past lives, which is, so how do we talk to our board about why do this?
You know, one thing that we did recently with an organization that we had a really productive conversation with was actually pulling what you need to make to rent a 1-bedroom apartment. And do you happen to have that number in front of you?
Right here. I have it right here. So the recommended rent to salary ratio in the United States is 30%. So essentially what that means is, for financial health, like there is a recommendation to not spend more than 30% of one's monthly gross income on rent to allow for fiscal stability. However, and I just have numbers for Ventura County because that was where the organization was that we were working with. 59% of renters pay more than 30% of in rent. The next great stat is 30% of Ventura County renters pay more than 50% of their take home, of their monthly gross income before taxes on rent. And the other indication that I always like to look at with this is the difference of cost of rent. So because Santa Barbara and Ventura counties are fairly expensive areas, I always really like to look at what is the difference, because there's what it costs to live in the county. So if you take all the rents in all parts of the county and double it, in Ventura County, the average rent for Ventura County is about $1,750. However, the average rent in the city of Ventura is about $2,250. So you're looking at a pretty significant pay difference right there in terms of, so where do your employees live? Are your employees living in kind of like the lowest income areas or the lowest kind of like outlier areas that are furthest away probably from where your organization's headquarters are? And so then they're like, well, then there's always the argument of, well, if they live in those cheaper areas, like, is it okay to pay them less? The answer is absolutely not, because they still have to pay a significant amount of money to get to your office. And I don't know if you've seen what gas prices are right now, but they ain't fun.
Well, and also strong organizations have people who work at them who live in the community. And,
yes.
If you're commuting out, number one, bad for the environment, number two, expensive for that employee, but number three, burnout. Very few people are like, yippee skippy, I get to commute an hour.
I love spending 3 hours a day in the car. It makes me so happy, said nobody ever. So as we're looking at like what a good pay, like base pay is, really keep into consideration, like what is the cost of rent in your city that your organization is headquartered in. Look at that as like, if we were to give 30% of that, like, or what that 30% cost overhead is. And again, it's going to be slightly different for individuals versus couples, but you're not necessarily trying to base all of this hoping that somebody has a significant other or a roommate that is also covering rent. But try to find something close to that so that they're not paying more than 50% of their monthly take home on rent, because that's not thriving. That's barely above poverty at that point.
Well, and so what that speaks to is what we opened with, which is a thriving wage. Can you comfortably afford a decent, safe place to live while still being able to save for a rainy day, have reliable transportation, have spending on things that are meaningful to you? Like, do you have any breathing room? How many people in our community or in the United States just have no breathing room? And
more than 20% don't have $400 saved for a rainy day.
And if your employees are living with that stress, they're not going to show up well. And they might be looking for what's the next opportunity where I can make just a little bit more money, because things are so tight and it's very uncomfortable to be so tight.
And there's been a lot of research on this, to show that like I always hate to use this analogy, but it's kind of like going on a diet. Like if you're on a diet, you think about food all the time. If you're not making enough money, you're thinking about money all the time. And so it's really hard to actually show up as your best self when you're constantly worried about like making sure rent is going to be taken care of, like making sure you have groceries on the table, making sure you have gas in the car, because that's been a huge expense right now. And so the less like we're able to kind of remove that that decision fatigue from our employees, the more literal brain space that they have available to put into your mission. And we're at 25 minutes.
We're done, my friend.
This one was good. This is a really important topic. And I know that so many nonprofits are scared to have this conversation because so many nonprofits aren't paying living wages, or they're barely paying living wages, therefore not thriving wages. And so it's so easy to just be like, well, everybody else is doing this, so it's just easy to fall on that crutch. But I think those organizations that are willing to kind of like lean into being on that front edge of paying people well, you're going to get amazing candidates later down the road. You're going to be known as the place to work. So people are going to be like knocking down your door to get into your organization. And so if you have questions, go ahead and drop them into the chat box right now. We will hang out for about 2 to 3 more minutes just to answer any of your questions. The answer is yes, this is definitely going to be made available afterwards. Feel free to share it with your boards. Feel free to share it with your executive directors. If you want us to come into a board retreat to kind of like share some of this information too, please let us know. This is a lot of our pro bono work this year, because this is how we are putting diversity, equity, and inclusion into our mission, vision, and values, is that we're actually investing our company's time and money so that we can share this information with nonprofits. So if this is something you want to be done for a presentation you want for your board, or even just a conversation over Zoom with an executive director, like we are more than happy to be giving away this time, because at the end of the day, like we just want to see our nonprofit sector employees thrive. We want to see you all buy houses. We want to see you save for retirement. We want to see you go out for dinner once in a while without feeling like you have to budget for it, because there is a lot of freedom, emotional freedom, financial freedom in not having to like count like your checkbook really narrowly every single month. And so we really want that sort of freedom for all of our employees across the nonprofit sector. So that's what this is all about. So do we have any questions, Emily?
We do. How does paying thriving wages impact the hiring process?
Oh, okay. So yes, I love this. So from the hiring process, we had kind of touched on it earlier. You're going to get employees that actually want to work for you because they think that you align with their mission, vision, values, instead of employees that can just, quote, afford to work for you. So when we were paying lower wages, we actually, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, we got a lot of middle-aged white women who had husbands who made significant amounts of money. And so if we wanted to diversify our team, which was really important, we actually had to offer wages that attracted different clients, but different applicants as well, because people were like, oh, I'm qualified to do that, and they're paying what I want to get paid, or what I think I should get paid for that, instead of people who are like, this sounds fun, I would, this would be soul-filling work for me, because they're different types of applicants. Like, let's be very honest. And I'm not trying to be like crass about that at all, but the better you pay, the more diversified your applicant pool is going to be, hands down.
Well, and it's expensive to live where we live. And so, if you're paying less, then there's a decent chance that you are only going to attract married people, or people who live with a partner or live with a roommate. And so, it's just like, even that simply of like, we should be paying our employees enough that they can live on their own and not, have a roommate, or like we could employ single people. That would be cool.
Yeah. But I think it's also like, when we were having this conversation about like, executive directors a couple weeks ago. So executive directors who've lived in the area have a significantly different cost of living than people who've just moved to the area. So executive directors who've been in Santa Barbara for 30 years, their mortgage is probably less than what people are paying in rent right now. And so it's definitely a big like financial blind spot that we tend to have. And of course, like executives absolutely need to be paid more because their workload is heavy. But it's something to keep in mind is like the ratio of like what is that based on how long they've been here, how much of their take home are they spending on mortgage or rent versus somebody who's just coming in. And we want to make sure that that person just coming into the organization can work for the organization and can make rent comfortably, because those are important things for stability reasons.
Well, and we like to look too first at what is the differential between the highest paid employee and the lowest paid employee, and make sure that you can feel good about that number. Like if you just say what that percentage is, or look at that like annual gross revenue, can you sleep at night? Number one. But number two, look to the difference between your highest paid employee and the second highest paid employee, because that gap shouldn't be astronomical, and like you said, there does need to be a gap, right? The executive director gets paid more than the deputy executive director or whatever, like that makes sense. But that gap shouldn't be ginormous.
Right. And if your executive director is getting paid, let's just say $150,000 a year, which is a nice competitive round number, it also means that your lowest paid employee full-time, not necessarily part-time, but your lowest paid employee shouldn't necessarily be paid 38 to 40 a year. It's like that's a pretty significant gap. And so it's just having that conversation, because also we look at these things in silos. So numbers are all done in silos, right? And I think that there is actually something really reasonable about having a little bit of transparency in pay, because it makes everybody feel good about where they are. Like our employees know that we get paid more than them, and they are fully comfortable with that because they know that we're the ones that have to go do the talking on behalf of the organization. We're the ones that have to have the tough conversations. We're the ones that do the negotiating. And so, but we feel good about the gap between the highest paid employee and our lowest paid employee right now. And that took an adjustment, recently, but it's one that we feel really good about.
And it's a statement about values too. Can you really look that lowest paid employee in the eye and say, oh, our people are the most important to us, and we value you 1/4 as much as this person? Like you can't. And that is not, that I guarantee you, no matter what organization it is, that is not in line with your mission, vision, values, because we're all here because we want to make the world a better place. And we can't do that effectively until we start from within.
And that's not to take the top down, but it's to raise the bottom up. And I think that that's the really important part. We don't want to pay all of our employees less for the sake of that, but we want to bring that bottom up so that it is more in line.
And so another expansion of how this impacts hiring. So I mentioned that we've got a 3-year target. And so part of our hiring process right now is to acknowledge with our applicants, we're not there yet. We're not where we want to be. Here's where we are today. It's an improvement from where we were 2 years ago. And here's where we want to be in the future. So it's a communication of, we acknowledge that we have work to do, we are working on it, and here's what we're targeting. And so that has also been, I think, an interesting conversation with our applicants, both in transparency, but also acknowledging that we do have room to grow, and we know that, and we're making strides towards that.
Any other questions that people might have, feel free to pop it into the chat box. But this has actually been a really good conversation. It's one of those topics that really means the world to us. So if you have anything, do let us know. But while you're thinking about that, I also just kind of want to make a small plug, because we do have a job open right now for a project coordinator. We're looking for somebody with about 4 to 5 years of administrative experience. And we're, so that is on our website somewhere, I believe. It's also posted on Indeed. And so, yeah, we're also currently hiring. That's been a really good part about as weird as that sounds, that's also one way that we're taking care of our current employees, is by hiring more to make sure that the workload is not burning our employees out. Because we just survived a pandemic. Praise be, we just survived a pandemic. and our company is still intact. And so we've been able to kind of use this as an opportunity of like, okay, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and how do we make sure that we're staffed to a point that we are not going to continue to burn out our employees.
Yeah.
Okay, so our staff works remotely, correct? The answer is yes, we are a fully remote company. We made that decision back in September. The lease on our office was up and we were just like, you know what, that is whatever it was, $850 a month that we don't need to spend. And so we decided to invest that back into, again, we invested that back into our employees. We decided, it was kind of a tough decision, but it was one of those, and we're making adjustments to be a fully remote company still. So we're actually changing like what our employee onboarding looks like. We're changing like what our employee handbook looks like. So in our company procedures. And so going remote isn't just flipping a switch. There's a whole process that goes with that. And we have actually our internal team right now working on revamping, you know, especially for if we're hiring this new person, we want to make sure that we onboard them really well. We want to make sure that all of our internal procedures are really in place and that our new employee handbook is really done before they come on into this new fully virtual environment.
Yeah, and we were, 90% remote before the pandemic. And so that's actually going to be the topic of our next conversation in 2 weeks, which is how do you really maintain a thriving remote workforce? Because it is not simply about making sure everyone has a laptop and like a quiet space to work. It is hard to maintain your team's connection and sense of support when you're not physically in the same space. And so, in the same way that pay equity is Kristiana's passion project this year, transitioning to a remote or a hybrid workplace and doing it really successfully is my passion project forever. So definitely pop any more questions in the chat, but come back with us in 2 weeks because we're going to be talking about best practices and sort of our journey in maintaining a thriving remote work environment.
And I also just realized my mug matches your shirt.
Dang.
Isn't that cute? Look at us showing up twinsy today.
Yeah. All right, my friends.
Thank you so much for your time this morning. We so appreciate doing these with you. You are all wonderful. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for showing up. This will be recorded and we'll send it out to you as soon as we're done. But thank you so much for your time, effort, and energy this morning. We'll see you all soon. Bye.